What happens when you take an established Marvel property, a developer with a track record of making some really good games, and a publisher that's published some of the greatest RPGs of all time? Well, you get this.
How are they able to float?
That's it? That's what you've been bragging about?
What do you mean?
Nothing. It's
Your experience fighting Centurions will be necessary here, woman. Hold them down, Groot! Rocket! Sure are a lot of things ready to this! Guys, huddle up!
So what is Guardians of the Galaxy? Well, Guardians of the Galaxy is a third-person single-player action-adventure developed by EDS Montreal, the developers behind the newer Deus Ex games, and published by Square Enix. It was released in 2021 and tells the story of the newly found Guardians of the Galaxy, who of a series of events leads to a releasing of an ancient evil that threatens not only their business, but the entire galaxy. They must now work together to save it. The story of Guardians of the Galaxy is a gigantic space adventure with big bombastic moments, while providing some human elements as well. Think of it as the counterpart of what it is, those Marvel films we'll get to watch, which are big action set pieces. While these are not the same characters from the film, they are different from their movie counterparts, but still somewhat in the same vein of them. They are still likable bunch from the movies and from the comics as well. But this is probably the best versions of these characters aside from the comics. The game takes place after a war with the mad titan Thanos, and follows a completely new storyline, not one from the movies or the comics, so you don't need to brush up on any knowledge beforehand. The story does drag a bit in the middle, but overall, it's a great story with good voice acting, good talent, and good music. At some points, the game does present you with choices. These choices basically try to give you a different outcome, but they aren't really that great, and there's not that much of a difference. The earliest choice you have is either to sell Groot or to sell Rocket. At the end of the day, you still wind up at the same destination, just certain events are quite different. If you ever wanted to play a Marvel movie, then this is the game for you. It's big, it's loud, bombastic, the action scenes are all great, and you just have the cinematic moments that all happen everywhere else. The game takes a lot of inspiration from the comics and from the film itself, both with its music, its direction in level design and art design as well. And this leads me to the level design and how some of these levels are just truly brilliant. Each level in Guardians of the Galaxy is truly amazing, each of them being something completely unique from one another. It's filled with so many unique and small details that it truly just makes it a breathtaking sight. They are all very, very memorable. One of my favorite places in the game is Nowhere. It is filled with so many small things and interactions that not only have small nods to the bigger Marvel universe, but world building for the game. I loved every level and how it looks, especially one of the first levels in the game, where it has this very much space theme, but also this gooey texture of this slime that they have hidden everywhere. It just brings the world to light. I love the bright colors, and I love the puzzles that you get to work with your Guardians with to really access some of the higher areas or some of the hidden levels. Not everything is great with the levels. I do feel like they're very linear, they're too small, and while exploring does give you some stuff, you don't even really need to, and there hardly is any real difficult puzzles. I especially also loved the Milano, the spaceship of the Guardians of the Galaxy, with all the different heroes having their different rooms and all presenting out their personality, and all the small nods and touches you can find in that ship. It's really good. Some really great level design in this game. Now the game does try to separate itself from the movies, and it does take inspiration from all over the films and the comics, but the biggest inspiration it takes is from its music. The game has a great 80s and 90s licensed soundtrack that reminds me of the films, which heavily inspires those things. But while the game has a good licensed soundtrack, it also has a really good original soundtrack from the orchestral and from the fictional band Star-Lord in the game. Some really good tracks in there, and you should really take a listen, especially that Star-Lord band. They're actually pretty good. But if you do want to stream the game or let's play it, well, there is a streamer mode that will replace the licensed music with the game's soundtrack. There's just one problem. It doesn't really work, and it's kind of irritating to use. Firstly, there will always be a title in the game that has streamer mode on. It kind of makes it feel like you're playing a pirated game. And second, while it's supposed to replace the songs in theory, it doesn't really work. It leaves many of the scenes in silence with just sound effects. which is very weird, and I'm surprised they never patched it out. So songs that would have been playing in these moments don't get played at all, and you just basically have silence and sound effects. So it's really weird. So the game has some really good voice acting. Graphics is fantastic, the facial animation is unbelievable, and the story is good as well. But where I feel the game lets me down is in its combat. Don't get me wrong, the combat is okay, but there is something that keeps me coming back to the combat because I just didn't find it that interesting. Let me explain. In combat, you only control Star-Lord. You give instructions to the other Guardians in combat. You'll be dodging and using speed to damage your enemies with your guns. The closer you are, the more damage you do. Each Guardian has 3 abilities, with a 4th special ability unlocked later during the story. Each one has different stats for damage, stamina, and cooldown, with some attacks being AoEs or single attacks. The same goes for you as well playing Star-Lord, who also has special attacks and a 4th ability unlocked much later. But you also get access to elemental attacks, fire, wind, and ice. For the enemies, there's a good variety of them. I like the different varieties you have both on the different levels you play them on and how they all act. Each enemy has a stamina bar that, if filled up, will allow you to do more damage. To fill up the stamina bar, you have to use abilities that either attack stamina or use an element that they are weak to. After every encounter, you will gain some experience to unlock new moves for each other. Each Guardian has a specific speciality. Groot is good for holding down enemies, Rocket does some great AoE, Gamora does high damage, and Drax well about stunning enemies. The last little bit of gameplay you gotta know is the huddle. You have to fill up the bar after you continue fighting. After these encounters, the Guardians will then gather around you. You shout a few phrases in them, and if you choose the correct response, your team will get a damage boost and allow you to use their abilities on an unlimited time. Choose the wrong answer, and only you will get the boost. Now, this system sounds all very complicated, filling up stamina bar, using weaknesses, trying to use the abilities of the Guardians. But it's actually not that complicated. In fact, it's very simple, and also really boring. All combat goes exactly how it starts, by you dodging, shooting, using ability, waiting for the cooldown, continue dodging and shooting with occasional button prompts, use the ability again, rinse and repeat. There's never anything interesting about this combat. It's just sheer boredom that begins to play over me when I play this game. Look, I can understand them not making you want to play as the other Guardians, but at least in combat it would have been a lot more fun. And I don't know what it is about the abilities in this game, but no matter what ability I used, it always felt that the cooldown was just too long. And you would be standing there waiting to do the next ability, but because they've used it in the beginning of the fight, you're not going to be able to use it again for a very long time. And I think they knew this, because at certain points for some enemies, you'll have button prompts that appear, and this will allow another Guardian to basically either kill them or do high damage. And for other bigger monsters, it can even be an insta-kill. If you miss this insta-kill, you gotta kill them normally. I don't know what it was, but they just felt like the game just didn't want you to enjoy combat. What adds to the boredom of this gameplay is the number of enemies that you have to face. You will fight a lot of battles in this game. Getting from point A to B in each level will have you in at least a minimum of 7 fights. And they don't become any harder, they just add more enemies. What sucks is that on the harder difficulty of this game, they just become bullet sponges, making all this combat just mindless. With this being a single player game, it's very difficult to have fun with this title in the combat for me. And battles become even more meaningless like halfway through the game, as you'll have unlocked everyone's abilities by then, and you don't even receive experience anymore. So what's the use of even having all this combat and fighting? Every single time it came to me getting into a fight, I went, ugh, I have to fight. Instead of me going, yeah, combat. I was let down by this gameplay as it felt very constrictive. This coming from EDS Montreal, who's known for creating gameplay that allowed you to experiment in various ways. Now the game does allow you to customize various factors to tailor your experience, such as how much damage you do, how much damage enemies do, how much experience you gain, but the out-of-box experience isn't good. And look, you won't be able to really fiddle with that unless you've really played the game. So combat to me was a bit boring, and this tediousness of the combat really did harm the levels for me. You see, the levels are beautifully designed, but they aren't interesting to explore. Yes, you can explore and find things in the game, and there are not that many stuff to find. You have components which you can use to buff Star-Lord, And then you have items for world building, lore items for world building, and Guardian specific lore items that you can find that you can take back to the Milano and talk to them about. That's actually really well done and really awesome. And then lastly, you can find alternative outfits, which I think are the best things to find, because the outfits are actually really good. Some from comics, some from the movies, and some completely made for the game. They all are really well done and look really good in detail. But for me, the combat just never evolved. It never got any interesting. It never tried to make any interesting. And the same goes for the boss fights. I feel the boss fights just aren't that interesting as well. You're doing a lot of time of just shooting. And even when you get the buffs in the game, again, by halfway through the game, if you've explored just a little bit, you don't even have to collect components anymore. You won't be using your visor that much anymore because there's no need to even try to explore in the game except try to get the outfits and some of the lore items. As for the levels themselves, as I said, they are great and well designed. They are very long, very long. And so to basically fill in that time, they have the Guardian talk a lot. Like a lot. If you thought that there was so much speaking in the game that it would be annoying, it can get pretty annoying. To be fair, the conversations are very organic, and even when you walk off a path, they'll continue talking or even talk to you as to why you're going off there. There's nothing there. But I always felt like the levels should have just had at least something. There's no side quests, there's no side missions, this is a straight point to end campaign. Nothing else is out there. And I feel like it's a bit of a missed opportunity in some cases. Yes, I understand and would have taken away from the pacing of the game, but maybe just something to give you a little bit more to do in the levels except just running around and just walk from point A to B. At most times, it felt like I should rather watch the games on YouTube than play it. It just, I don't know, the combat to me never felt good. So what did you guys think about the combat? Because like I couldn't get into it. I just felt that it was too slow at times, very constrictive, and like you can't even really do combos. I was thinking this game was going to be like an Ultimate Marvel Alliance type where you have combos and you make a lot of combos with your Guardians, but that doesn't even really happen. And you do get like a style meter or a meter to fill up, but that also wasn't that fun to really do because you can just run around and shoot. And I hardly ever died in fights as well, like hardly ever. There's only like once or twice where I glitched, and one I followed the map like a lot of times because sometimes they had like platforming sections in these combat sections. But they just felt like filler and padding a lot of the times because sometimes they just add so much enemies and a fight can usually take 10 minutes, maybe even 15 minutes. So I would recommend if you do want to enjoy this game, play it on normal, maybe play it on an easier level because playing it on hard was really boring because all they are bullet sponges and they don't even do that much damage to you. Or maybe tweak some of the settings to make it a bit more fun because overall, combat to me was a huge letdown. I can also understand why many people didn't play this game because the combat gets boring very quickly. Like after the first two levels, I was like, okay, that's really cool combat. And then I just got like into this mindless state of like, oh yes, combat. And I went into like a zen mode whenever I played it. You know what it felt like? It felt like an RPG where you're at a high level and you are going back to like the first level and it's like a random encounter RPG. You just run into a random encounter and you're just spamming the quickest attacks to finish the battle quickly because you're very bored at this point. But the problem is in this game, you never feel like that because it's always a fight and it's always like bullet sponge after bullet sponge after bullet sponge after bullet sponge. And it wasn't really that interesting at all. I will admit that the AI for the enemies are really good. They like to force you out of situations. They like to use AoEs. Some of the enemies are very annoying and the Guardians AIs are not too bad as well. But like again, I feel like the way they could have fixed it was to switch between Guardians or at least to really fix on the cooldown. I don't know what it was, but the cooldown was always the biggest issue for me in this game. You want to use a lot of their abilities so many times, but in a fight, you'll probably only use it like 3 times at most. And that's like using one person's ability more than once. Because you'll usually start out the fight by using their abilities, and then for like half of that fight, you're not going to see that ability again till the next half of the fight, which kind of sucks. Look, I can understand people didn't play this game, and I can understand the combat not being that great, but it just sucks that EDS Montreal couldn't make something a bit more fun and engaging, in my opinion. Now you could like the combat, and if you did, tell me what you liked about it. I couldn't vibe with it. So we've talked about the things I like about the game and what Guardians of the Galaxy is. But Guardians of the Galaxy is considered a hidden gem, an underrated game that never got the shine it's supposed to be, and I like to break down on why that exactly happened. Look, I do think this is a good game, but there are things that do let me down, as I've said before, the gameplay. But to be fair, this game was given quite the push when it was announced back at a Square Enix event at E3 2021. It came with a reveal trailer, and even at the end of the show there was a gameplay demonstration. There was more coverage on this game than Final Fantasy 16 at the time. Might have rubbed people the wrong way. The game for me also wasn't really marketed well. The gameplay wasn't enticing to turn heads, and they did a lot of time focusing on the music. Not to mention, they had a 4-month release schedule. When they announced this game in June, I believe, it came out in October. So that's not a lot of time to build a lot of hype on it. And they focused a lot on the music, and it just didn't really sell you enough. Not to mention, Guardians of the Galaxy is really hard to sell. People know Spider-Man. People know the Avengers. They don't really know what game we're going to get from Guardians of the Galaxy. It just was really hard to sell you on. It's one of those games that you must play it for it to sell. I also think the release of another Marvel property under Square Enix kind of soured people. Marvel Avengers. Big marketing push, a big budget, huge story campaign, and when people played it, the story campaign was hardly even talked about because the gameplay was so boring. I think they just left a bad taste in everyone's mouth. And yes, maybe the single player harmed it, and they didn't have any co-op for it, and again, there was no DLC planned for this game. Look, I do think it's a hidden gem. I do think you should give this game a try. The gameplay might make you very bored, but it's got a great story, really good graphics, and fantastic music. The game lasts about 15 hours, and there isn't really much replayability due to the combat just being very boring and the choices being nothing special. Like I said, while you can make these choices, you still wind up at the same place. There's no need to play the whole game again just for those choices. They don't really do anything. It's a shame you'll never get to see a sequel from this, as Square Enix of course sold all their Western studios off due to the fading sales numbers to the Embracer Group, and Eidos Montreal will probably go back to making Deus Ex. But who knows in the future what the future can hold. I do think Eidos Montreal is a really good studio, and this game shows their talent and their ability to go into something else. I really would have loved to have seen a sequel from this game. The game is available on all consoles, and you can probably find it on many subscription services, because Square Enix put this game on everything because it didn't really sell well. I do think it does deserve its credit as one of those games that came out in 2021 as the best ever. It's just a shame it didn't sell that well. But overall, Guardians of the Galaxy is a space adventure worth your time.
Are you gonna be okay?
Yeah. It was just so...
Metal?
Hey, thanks for watching the video. If you liked it, please comment, like, subscribe, share the video, all the normal YouTube stuff. I'll be back with another video very, very soon.